Hello everybody. I'm sure this video is bound to start a few flame wars somewhere, as the subject is contentious to say the least in at least a few circles on the internet. Now, what's the subject, you ask? Well, for those of you who've managed to reach this point without noticing the video title, the subject is the merits of the so-called British armoured carrier approach versus the so-called American unarmoured carrier of the Second World War. Now, let's start off by pointing out that calling one side armoured and the other unarmoured is a gross oversimplification. Both nations' carriers were armoured along the hull. The primary difference, which the debate generally revolves around, is the flight deck. On British carriers, that are involved in this debate at least, the flight deck, which is the uppermost full-length deck and the one all the aircraft fly off from, was also an armoured deck. On American carriers, it wasn't, any armour present on the horizontal plane being present much lower in the ship below the hangars. It also needs to be borne in mind that British carriers' deck armour did not run the full length of the flight deck. The hangar and its roof formed an armoured box, and the ends of the flight deck were strengthened, but not fully armoured. And let's also point out that there are extreme views on both sides. You're going to have some who are going to say, oh yeah, the Royal Navy was stupid, their carriers were worthless, they destroyed themselves, and any American carrier would walk right over them and sink the big metal coffin with a single hit. Those people are idiots. On the other hand, you have some people who will say, oh, well, the British carriers would shrug off anything the Americans could throw at them. It doesn't matter if 98% of the British air group is wiped out. A single bomb getting through will total the fragile American bath toy. And those people are also idiots. What we're going to look at is the ships in question, the design choices that influence their construction, the pros and cons in the most important areas, and then assess the outcomes. Now, of course, I have my own opinion, but the main goal of this video is to lay out the facts and allow people to make their own decisions. Because, quite frankly, not even the major naval historians are all agreed on the efficacy or not of the two nations' approaches. You read Brown, Friedman, Doolan, Gangarski, or a number of well-respected naval historians, and every one of them has their own take on it. So for me to try and say, nope, this is the one and final and only true take on it would be hubris on a colossal scale. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to look at 5 ship classes. On the Royal Navy side of things, we're going to look at HMS Ark Royal, the Illustrious and Implacable classes. And on the American side of things, we're going to look at the Yorktown and Essex classes, as these 5 groups of ships are roughly contemporary, and they cover the period in question. The original USS Wasp is discounted because she was deliberately built light to use up treaty tonnage, and thus it wouldn't be a fair example to use. Now, the ships were designed and built in the following order: the Ark Royal, followed by the Yorktowns, then the Illustriouses, then the Implacables, and finally the Essexes. HMS Indomitable, the last of the Illustrious class, was something of a halfway house between that class and the Implacables. Now, the first thing to note about the two navies is that their carriers were designed for primarily operating in specific environments, although obviously both navies had global commitments, and this is quite telling from the start, especially in the Royal Navy's case. The American carriers were designed to operate mostly in the Pacific against Japan. The Yorktowns, because at the time that Japan was considered the primary likely enemy when the Yorktowns were being built, and most of the Essexes were built when Japan physically was the primary enemy. In contrast, the British built HMS Ark Royal when they also believed the most likely enemy was going to be Japan, whereas by the time the Illustrious and Implacable classes came about, the most likely enemy for the UK was definitely a European power. This, in turn, led to different priorities in the matter of self-defense. For an American carrier, or the Ark Royal, in the wide expanses of the Pacific, the most likely, and in most imaginable circumstances only possible enemy, was going to be another carrier's flight group, or possibly small groups of aircraft from various small island bases, as nobody expected aircraft like the Zero to have a range more comparable to a heavy bomber than a strike fighter. Either way, such opponents would have a finite supply of aircraft that was within the capacity of a friendly carrier to match, since both sides would face similar operational constraints when it came to aircraft size and payload. Such aircraft would also have a more limited bomb and/or torpedo load compared to heavier aircraft that could be based from major airfields on land. And any strike package would not be composed entirely of strike craft, since any carrier group would also have to carry their own fighters. Therefore, the logical concept arose that the best way to defend a carrier would be to have the carrier equipped with the largest number of aircraft possible in order to match and hopefully overwhelm the incoming attackers, who would not be able to overpower such an air group without deploying more carrier hulls to the fight than the navy in question. And the USA was pretty sure that it could outbuild almost any potential combination of enemies. In this scenario, you would either break up and destroy incoming attacks with your own aircraft, or weaken them enough that the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries and a little bit of prudent dodging would allow the ships to evade being struck at all, at which point your large air group could mass a counterstrike large enough to destroy the enemy. In the European theatre, with the confined waters of the Mediterranean and North Sea and the other associated areas, the primary expected threat, and indeed the only threat, unless and until another European navy actually built a functional aircraft carrier, was land-based aircraft. These posed two significant problems above and beyond the expected opposition in the Pacific. Firstly, in addition to single-engine aircraft, you could expect 2, 3, and 4-engine medium and heavy bombers carrying bigger bombs, and more of them, as well as single or multiple torpedoes. Perhaps more importantly, with multiple full-scale airfields to operate from, you could also expect assaults in overwhelming numbers. It really didn't matter if your carrier had 1, 2, or 3 squadrons of fighters if the enemy turned up with half a dozen of their own fighter squadrons, and the same again in strike aircraft. Assuming the competence of your enemy was even within shouting distance of your own, those attackers would get through, and in fairly large numbers. And at that point, it would be inevitable that you would get hit, so it becomes more important to protect your ship from the inevitable impact. A number of American war games, the fleet problems of the 1930s, also seem to indicate that whoever attacked first would likely sink the enemy carrier or carriers outright. And the advancing performance of aircraft in the period immediately before the invention and deployment of shipborne radar, is specifically in the field of speed, seemed to indicate to both navies that a carrier's own fighters would be likely unable to intercept incoming attacks unless they were already airborne for some reason. The lessons drawn from this were again quite different, with the Americans concluding that the biggest strike group possible would allow them to do as much damage as possible, ideally before the enemy found them, and if not, then at least do more damage than the loss of their own carriers would entail. The British, perhaps more pessimistically, concluded that outside of enough fighters for a combat air patrol, the main emphasis should be on surviving the inevitable in order to strike again after they'd been hit. There was an additional factor. Whilst most carrier-based aircraft could carry 250 or 500-pound bombs, land-based bombers and dive bombers could be expected to more consistently bring 1,000-pound bombs or greater into play, which could not only punch deeper but carried a lot more explosive power. And so the risk of fatal damage from even 1 or 2 hits was much more significant when facing land-based opponents. And of course, you can't sink an airfield, which meant you could expect day after day after day of sustained attack. And even if you somehow fought through a much larger land-based air defence and managed to knock out an airfield, there would be half a dozen more in range, and a runway was relatively easy to repair, as it didn't need to spend weeks or months heading to and from a dry dock. This, in turn, dictated the basic decision on whether or not to use an armoured deck. For the illustrious and implacable classes designed to operate in range of massed land-based air forces, it was no choice at all. They were going to be attacked, no air group they could get on a single carrier or multiple carriers would be able to stop a massed land-based assault, and you could reasonably expect to get hit as a result. For the Ark Royal, the Yorktowns and the Essexes, operating in theory far from major land-based support against more limited air groups, if you could maul 1 or 2 large strike waves, you could reasonably conclude the danger was over, and it was unlikely the enemy could utterly overwhelm you. And so the flight deck was kept unarmoured to maximise the air group. So, what impact did this and other decisions have on general operation and on the ship's air group? We'll now look through a number of factors that influenced a carrier's air group size and strike capabilities and see how they were affected by or affected the choice of armoured or unarmoured flight decks. So, deck parks. One of the other major differences in various ships' early operational careers was the use of deck parks. This is where a portion of your aircraft are stored on the flight deck instead of in the hangar. For the American carriers, this was pretty much a given, and increased the number of operational aircraft that could be carried simply because of the additional storage space this offered. Aircraft are of course full of things that like to burn and explode, but with a flight deck that offered little resistance to bombs, it scarcely made much difference where the aircraft were when a bomb hit. In fact, having them on the deck was in some cases safer, since a burning aircraft could be shoved overboard if they caught fire, whereas the same aircraft on fire in the hangar was a much more complex and deadly issue. There was also the weather. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, apart from the occasional typhoon, the sea was usually, relatively speaking, fairly calm, and storing aircraft on deck posed little risk of damage or loss. In the North Sea, on the other hand, aircraft on deck could reasonably be expected to either fall or be washed overboard, or damaged or even torn free by these fairly regular storms and heavy seas encountered. The Mediterranean was usually a little calmer, but when it got rough, which it did on a regular basis, it got really rough, and being an enclosed body of water, there were precious few places you could actually go, whereas in the Pacific, you could usually avoid a typhoon if you were given enough warning. This meant that regardless of hangar storage space, an equal-sized American carrier would typically be able to carry more aircraft in total, at the risk of losing some of its air group in especially bad weather. The extreme of this was seen in the aftermath of one of the major typhoons that hit the Pacific theatre toward the end of World War II. A number of American carriers had lost significant numbers of aircraft, and the lighter-built flight decks of some ships had also suffered significant structural damage. Admiral Halsey, seeing the state of his own ships, signalled the nearby ships of the British Pacific Fleet to report their status in the aftermath of the typhoon. HMS Indefatigable, whose armoured hangar, enclosed bow and flight deck had withstood the whole thing just fine, rather cheekily signalled back, "What typhoon?" Now we look at hangars. These were particularly affected by design choices. American carriers tended to go for a so-called open hangar, and the British armoured carriers for a closed hangar, in small part due to the weather, but in larger part due to the nature of the flight deck. An armoured flight deck needed plenty of support, and the sides were necessarily therefore part of the hull, which meant they and their support beams, etc., were considerably thicker and would take up more space, which also limited available volume, but provided greater safety, assuming that the flight deck armour held, since all sides of the hangar were also armoured to protect against splinters, blast, shells, and gunfire. Also factored into this was hangar height. At the time that they were designed, they would of course fit the aircraft being used, but if they were built only just tall enough, then future aircraft might not fit. In the British carrier's case, due to the space and weight constraints imposed by the defensive systems, including the armour, the hangar heights were generally lower, and this would prevent them from operating some modern types of aircraft later in their lives. Interestingly, whilst the Yorktown, Illustrious and Essex all went with a single hangar, with the Illustrious having a hangar about 3 foot lower than the American ships, the Ark Royal, Indomitable and the Implacables actually had 2 hangar decks, although in the latter both decks were only 14 foot high compared to just over 17 foot in the American ships. The Illustrious's single hangar was actually about 4/5 the floor space of a Yorktown, and the Indomitable and Implacable had more space than the American design. But the deck park of the Yorktowns allowed for a greater overall number of operational aircraft to be carried in practice, with of course the Essex taking the biscuit and the cake as well, with the most operational aircraft plus plenty of spare parts, including aircraft bodies. Although, interestingly enough, with the deck park involved, Implacable actually becomes the most efficient ship in terms of aircraft carried per ton, likely due to that second hangar. Assuming they all fit, of course. It does bear mentioning that the number of aircraft aboard US carriers was often at various degrees of variance with the number of operational aircraft, due to the practice of carrying spare aircraft lashed up to the hangar roof in various states of assembly, whereas the British went for the Unicorn class of support carriers to deal with the repair and resupply of aircraft issue. For example, at one point in her career, Yorktown notionally carried 88 aircraft, but 22 of these were non-operational spares, with 66 in flying condition. But at other times, she would appear to carry fewer aircraft, but would actually be capable of flying more. Now, the aircraft themselves. The aircraft obviously used by the various navies also bear some relevance to their overall capacity. Towards the end of the war, Avengers and Corsairs and other similar aircraft were common in both navies' carriers. But the United States Navy had much better folding wing designs for its carrier aircraft, and this was especially telling at the start of the war when the two navies operated very different aircraft. The British tending to have aircraft that folded their wings around and back, whilst American aircraft folded their wings straight up, taking advantage of their taller hangars. Additionally, American carrier aircraft tended to be slightly smaller than their British counterparts, which further helped get more aircraft into a limited space. The Wildcat and Dauntless, for example, were both smaller than the Fulmar and Skua, which were their Royal Navy contemporaries. Only American torpedo bombers, the Devastator and the Avenger, tended to be slightly larger compared to their equivalents, the Swordfish and Barracuda. And usefully for the United States Navy, torpedo bombers were carried in smaller numbers compared to dive bombers and fighters in both Navy's ships. Overall, then, the aircraft operated meant that for a given amount of space, the Americans would usually be able to get a few more aircraft in compared to the British, at least until they started using broadly the same machines. Now let's look at the anti-aircraft armament. Part of the space and weight allotment of any carrier of this period is made up of its anti-aircraft battery. Now, using the ship's designed anti-aircraft armament, we can see where the priorities of the two navies lay. Now, obviously, all carriers would receive upgrades and additional guns in later life, but this is, for obvious reasons, in excess of what they were designed for. What's interesting is that it shows that it was actually the Royal Navy and not the United States Navy which placed far more emphasis on the ship being able to defend itself when you look at the total anti-aircraft suite, both counting and discounting light anti-aircraft up to 20mm, which gradually became obsolete during the war. Both in terms of overall number of gun barrels and in gun power per ton, the Royal Navy is significantly ahead, even comparing two classes built with some wartime experience, that being the Implacables and the Essex. Now, you can argue the particular effectiveness of any given anti-aircraft gun for hours on end, the machine guns and 1.1-inch guns on earlier carriers being found rather wanting, and replaced with a variety of 40mm, whether that's Bofors or pom-poms, and 20mm Oerlikons in later ships. But it is clear that from an as-designed viewpoint, the Royal Navy was clearly expecting its ships to have to defend themselves, as well as protect themselves separate from their air groups, far more than the United States Navy was. This additional commitment to anti-aircraft defence, with all the associated weight, ammunition, extra crew quarters, and other material and stores, would of course eat into the carrier's capacity to operate and carry aircraft. Now, let's have a look at the ship's size. One thing that's not always appreciated is the size of the various carriers. People tend to assume that they're all roughly the same, but this is far from the truth. American carriers tended to draw less water and be slightly narrower at the waterline, but also be considerably longer. Displacement also varies, with Yorktown's standard displacement being the smallest by quite a margin, and the Essex the heaviest by an even bigger margin. The greater volumetric density due to the armour and heavier anti-aircraft batteries on the British carriers can be seen from the fact that although the three British classes ranged from just over 2,000 tons to nearly 4,000 tons heavier, they were all considerably shorter than the Yorktowns, and vastly shorter than the much heavier Essexes. This difference in physical dimensions, especially length, that was possible due to their lighter construction would allow American ships more space, and hence more aircraft per ton in the Yorktowns. The sectional density of the Essex class was much higher, though, on a par with the British ships, but it did have a armoured hangar deck almost as thick as the British carrier's flight deck, which likely explains this, as well as why its aircraft per ton ratio is significantly worse than the Yorktowns. Its primary advantage over all the other carriers under construction being simple sheer size, giving it more capacity regardless of any other factors. Since the Essexes, even in their shorter version, were designed with about 4,000 tons more displacement than the next largest carrier under construction in the two navies, and finished up with a standard displacement that was considerably more, and partly due to this, they're about 100 feet longer than the British armoured carriers and almost as wide. This isn't to say that the Essexes weren't a good design. They very definitely were. But, at the same time, you would expect a ship several thousand tons heavier and 100 feet longer to be a better carrier, even if it was only an average design. So, its margin of superiority over everything else is not exactly surprising. Now, let's look at ships' durability. This is where most of the arguments about the two design philosophies tend to circulate. There are actually really three forms of durability to consider, which often gets overlooked. One is tactical durability. This is basically, if you hit the ship, can it come through with its protection system either avoiding or minimizing the damage to the extent that the ship can either continue immediate tactical operations or can be brought back up to operational status in good time. If the ship fails this test, then you have to move on to 2, survivable durability. This is if a ship takes a hit and is knocked out of action through severe damage, can the ship survive long enough to reach home port and be brought back into action through a dry dock? This also covers, at the lower end, damage that knocks the ship out of meaningful action for most or all of the current tactical operation, even if some form of operational capability is restored later. At the higher end, it covers the scenario of the ship basically being a floating wreck, but the key part being floating. A damaged ship, after all, can be repaired. A ship that sinks or is otherwise irrecoverable is a total loss. And finally, you have 3, strategic durability. This is assuming that the ship is so badly damaged it requires dockyard time. This aspect covers how long it needs in the dock, comparable to the attack directed at it, and also how the attack fundamentally affects the ship in question in later operations. For example, if the ship is torpedoed, but after repairs it functions as new, then it's good in this category. Conversely, if a ship is torpedoed in the same place by the same weapon, and would now forever be restricted in top speed due to the impact warping the hull frames, then the ship is fairly bad in this category. Durability has to be considered on a per-ship basis. The total number of ships present or lined up to replace it is somewhat irrelevant. Again, by example, if you drive a car that breaks down after 24 hours and needs a week in the workshop to repair, the fact that they're so cheap you have a dozen more lined up and you can just cycle through them to stay on the road doesn't make the cars themselves particularly durable, although your transport system is. There has, of course, been much written about this, some good and some horribly slanted in both directions. Some of the latter sounding very informed, but mixing in outright falsehoods with a few facts. So, there are 2 main types of attack where this durability difference comes into play: conventional bombing attack and kamikazes. This means leaving out ships that were sunk by torpedoes, gunfire, etc., unless they were also attacked in other ways previously, in which case how they held up under that assault is relevant, but their loss to torpedoes is not, since obviously torpedoes don't strike flight decks. In this respect, the tactical durability of the British carriers is quite startling compared to the American ships. So let's look at bomb hits first. Our first example, the USS Hornet. She was lost at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Now, her sinking was down mainly to the torpedo hits she took, but during the first assault we could also see that she was hit by 3 bombs of just over 500 pounds each, plus an unintentional kamikaze, as well as the torpedoes. 2 of these bombs were semi-armour piercing, and both would penetrate down by 3 decks and cause major damage. In total, 97 men would lose their lives to the 4 bomb-kamikaze impacts, and the ship would be unable to continue flight operations. The combined fighters of Hornet and Enterprise were unable to prevent the strikes coming in and landing their blows. Now, although it was the torpedoes in the first and second attacks that would send her to the bottom, there's no doubt that the ship would have been unable to continue operations without a major repair had the torpedoes not hit. In the same battle, 2 hits and 2 near misses by similar bombs on the Enterprise caused major damage, 44 deaths, and forced the ship to retire for repairs, although she was still able to recover aircraft. Now, Enterprise's constant brushes with the Imperial Japanese Navy provide a number of other examples. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she took 3 hits from 550-pound bombs. 2 semi-armor piercing penetrated several decks again and caused heavy damage, along with a general-purpose bomb that detonated on contact with the deck, alongside 4 near misses. In this case, she was again able to recover aircraft fairly soon after the attacks, at the cost of 77 dead, but would need several months of repairs to be combat capable again. Yorktown would lose 66 men at Coral Sea to a single penetrating hit from a 550-pound bomb that would also cripple her engines and need 3 months to repair. At Midway, splinters from a detonation on deck started a fire in the hangar. Another hit penetrated and knocked out some of her engines, and a third went through the side in the area of one of the elevators and caused a fire. Collectively, these brought the ship to a halt. Now, superb damage control was bringing the ship gradually back up to operational speed and working towards a resumption of flight operations for those aircraft still on the deck when a fatal torpedo strike came in. Now, looking at British ships, HMS Illustrious would take 5 near misses from 1,100 and 2,200-pound bombs, plus a total of 7 hits from a mixture of 550 and 1,100-pound bombs, as well as a single 2,200-pound bomb. Believe it or not, she was still able to operate as a carrier until the 2,200-pound bomb hit, which analysis indicated only just defeated the armour deck, but the hit would start fires and cause damage that put her out of action as a carrier, although the damage report did note that by initiating the bomb fuse and slowing its descent, the armoured deck meant the bomb exploded in the hangar and not several decks below, where it could have done crippling damage. Illustrious would be able to make it safely under her own power back to port, and she suffered 126 dead and needed months of repairs in a number of docks, not helped by the Luftwaffe bombing her while she was in her first dock, before she headed to the US to finish repairs, which also turned into a refit. Indomitable would take 2 hits and 3 near misses, mostly from 550-pound weapons, none of which would hit the armoured sections. They did knock her out of flight operations and kill 46 of the crew, requiring several months of repairs, but during the same operation, Victorious was hit by 2 small bombs, which did hit the armoured flight deck, which, according to the crew, sent the bombs bouncing over the side like cricket balls without doing any real damage. The Formidable would take 2 hits and a near miss from a 2,200-pound bomb, but remained operational, albeit that the bombs didn't hit dead centre, with 12 dead from the attacks. Overall, this brief summary would indicate that British carriers would tend to suffer fewer dead for a given weight of explosive, and in some cases could stay more operational. But looking at the battles and operations where these incidents occurred, they couldn't inflict as much damage on the enemy as the American carriers did in exchange for suffering their own damage. Additionally, given the effects of 550-pound bombs, it's doubtful that the American ships would have survived the hits that Illustrious suffered. However, due to the number of hits and the resultant overall damage taken, the British ships that needed dockyard work would need longer under repair, whereas the American ships, despite being more badly affected immediately, would require shorter time in dock before being back out in operational service. Now, switching over to Kamikazes, both nations' carriers would take multiple hits, including many glancing blows that did relatively little damage. However, when looking at kamikazes that landed solid hits, there is a major difference that becomes apparent. In these attacks, conditions were normally somewhat different to bombing attacks. The bombs carried by the kamikazes tended to be around 550 pounds, but their armour-piercing capacity was somewhat diminished due to either being still attached to or only just released from their aircraft. At the same time, the mass of the aircraft itself and the effects of any fuel still on board tended to add additional fire hazards to any impact. Every British armoured carrier, except for the Implacable, which appeared to have a charmed life, would be hit by at least one kamikaze strike, and some more than one. However, with the exception of one attack on Formidable, where a fragment of armour plate displaced by the bomb impact damaged some of the engines and temporarily reduced speed. The summation of all of these kamikaze attacks was minimal damage caused and minimal casualties suffered, with the ships universally back in full flight operations within hours, and sometimes less, with any damage repaired later on in dock once the tactical operation that the ships were taking part in had been completed. Conversely, of the ships of the classes under consideration, Enterprise, Essex, Intrepid, Randolph, Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, and Franklin all took kamikaze hits that caused major damage and forced the ships to retire for repairs with significant casualties, with Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, and Franklin being preserved solely by the excellent damage control efforts of their crews. In all these cases, the primary difference appeared to have been the flight deck. The British armoured decks stopped the attacks pretty much dead on, with little damage below the flight deck level. In a couple of cases, attacks were listed as glancing because the kamikazes came down solidly onto the ship's deck, but would simply bounce or skid over the side, whereas attacks on the American carriers would either penetrate the deck or blow a large hole in it, with the effect that significant damage and fire would spread into the hangar, which was of course full of more burnable and explosive material, which led to a much greater conflagration and more resultant damage. Hancock appeared to have both terrible and brilliant luck at the same time, being hit multiple times by fragments of kamikazes its AA had just about managed to shoot down, resulting in the ship never being out of action for more than a few hours. Overall, then, British carriers appear to have had significantly greater tactical survivability, especially against kamikazes. Both nations' carriers appear to have had good survivable durability, although the edge here would, I still think, go to British carriers, since they tended to be stopped in the water far less often, and a few losses to torpedo strikes in the United States Navy could be attributed to the ships being delayed by such engine malfunctions and shutdowns. The generally superb American damage control efforts kept a number of their ships afloat when most would have considered them lost. In terms of strategic durability, American ships appear to have repaired a lot faster, albeit you could argue this was because if you damaged a British carrier through its armour badly enough to need dock, you'd probably done a lot more damage, but nevertheless, neither nation lost a fleet carrier of the types considered to attacks associated with bombs or kamikazes alone, with all hull losses coming eventually from torpedo strikes. Evaluating from this, it would seem that the British armoured system was preferable from a viewpoint of keeping a ship alive and in action, and the United States Navy seemed to agree, since multiple reports from both frontline officers and evaluations back home all had a good opinion of the survivability of the British carriers and encouraged the use of a similar system on their own ships. Indeed, in large part because of these recommendations, the Midway class and all subsequent US carriers would have an armoured flight deck of some description. However, the Americans did not take on board the armoured hangar box, and indeed the British would also leave this behind in their post-war designs. Additionally, a carrier surviving is only one part of its capability as an operational weapons system. The discussion of armoured versus unarmoured flight decks focuses on the ships themselves, which for most naval ships is fine, but for carriers whose primary purpose is achieved by aircraft, it is not the whole picture. British carriers were limited in air group size and aircraft type, even later when their overall air groups increased due to deck parking and other measures. Some of this was due to there simply being smaller ships, but there was also a degree of effect from the greater weight of defensive features. This meant that aircraft losses affected their overall flight group more, and their overall strike power was less. For example, the kamikaze attacks left the carriers themselves relatively fine, but the aircraft destroyed in those attacks compromised their ability to keep fighting. Although the flip side of that is, of course, something like Bunker Hill being completely out of action was a 100% loss of the air group. However, it is, overall, striking power that is where, unsurprisingly, the American carriers have an advantage. You could make a pretty convincing case that the illustrious class could comfortably have survived and remained operational during the many batterings that the Hornet, Yorktown, and Enterprise endured in the first half of the Pacific Campaign, but you'd have very little chance of claiming that they would have done anywhere near the damage that the American carriers inflicted on the Imperial Japanese Navy at Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, etc. So at that point, it's perfectly valid to ask, which is better, to lose a carrier or two in exchange for destroying multiple enemy carriers, or to retain all of your carriers, but at the same time the enemy retains most or all of their own? That's a decision that obviously everyone has to make for themselves. Overall, the fact that both navies would adopt elements of the other's design, that being armoured flight decks in the US Navy and larger flight groups in the Royal Navy, respectively, amongst other things, would indicate to me that the true optimum was somewhere in the middle. However, based on the information provided in this video, I leave it to viewers to make their own final evaluation as to which was the better weapon system, or whether they were simply two sides of the same coin working towards an eventual common purpose design.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.